This video is only possible thanks to viewers like you. To support the channel and get more, go to patreon.com/optimisticduelist and subscribe. Link in the description. Alright, so for part 3 of this Deltarune mini-series, we'll be considering how Deltarune's story will evolve going forward, and how the worlds of Deltarune and Undertale might be connected. How will the Dark World change after Chapter 1? Why does Chris seem to recognize Sans, Undyne, and Elphys? And how might Chara, the demon, and Gaster, the spooky skeleton scientist, fit into the wider picture? But first, let's get some disclaimers out of the way. First, it's worth noting that this video is pure speculation on my part. I'm not pretending to have any hidden insight into Deltarune or Undertale, and the only reason I'm making this video at all is that, independent of whether or not it turns out to be true, the story I see taking shape in Deltarune seems really cool. And since we're going to be waiting on Deltarune for a while, we might as well talk about it. The second is yes, I am going to bring up Homestuck, eventually. But wait, Undertale fan who's already clicking out of the video. I want to promise you, before we get into this, that this video isn't a list of things in Deltarune that might be Homestuck references. For the record, I think the Homestuck fandom is going a little overboard noting Homestuck parallels in Deltarune, even if Lancer's bucket is pretty on the nose. This video is entirely about how I think Deltarune's narrative might take shape, based on the thematic ideas it's presented to us through both Undertale and Chapter 1. I think some of those ideas and executions have some interesting similarities with Homestuck, whether or not they were directly inspired by it, and I'm only going to use Homestuck to put the points I'm making into focus. All that said, let's dive in, starting with the Dark World. Now, last time we considered that the Dark World seems to be an imaginary realm, designed to help Lightners resolve their emotional issues, making the fearful Noelle, who's going through a difficult time in her life, the most likely candidate to get sucked into it next. The Dark World growing darker yet darker likely means that it's going to become more dreamlike and fantastical as we move through the story. But what will those changes actually look like? What does it mean that the shadows start to grow, or that the places that we know seem like fantasy? I think this shift is likely to manifest in two different ways. First, as the world gets darker, it'll grow more serious and scary, more nightmarish. And as it grows more fantastical, the storytelling logic that rules over it will get more strict and intense. To get a sense of how this might work, let's focus on Lancer. By the very nature of his being and his role in the Dark World, Lancer is an antagonist. In storytelling tropes, a Lancer is specifically a second in command, and both he and his father identify themselves the same way. They're the bad guys. In Chapter 1, he's won over easily enough, but if in future iterations of the Dark World, the world is darker and more driven by the storytelling logic, then that essentially means Lancer will be more and more trapped in this bad guy role, forced to oppose you even if he doesn't necessarily want to. But he might be given a reason. For example, if whatever you did to the fountain at the end did something bad to the Dark World, he might be moved to oppose you. Jevil mentions that the Queen is coming to the Dark World too, and if we're talking about the Queen of Spades, then she's essentially Lancer's mother, so she might be even more effective at motivating him than the King was. In any case, if for whatever reason Lancer is forced to oppose you again, I can see the Dark World changing him to be more threatening and imposing as well. We could see Lancer evolving in stages into older and more imposing versions of himself. We could even see his cute childhood bike evolving into more genuinely cool and badass looking motorcycles to match him. Conveniently, the nature of this conflict would also push Susie to become more and more of a hero, a growth that will likely culminate in whatever she does to cause Undertale to happen eventually. In any case, however the Dark World evolves going forward, I'm feeling pretty confident about at least one thing. Whatever ongoing apocalypse scenario is gonna be visiting the Dark World, it's already hit it at least once. I mainly think that's the case because of Sans and Papyrus, who apparently just moved into Chris's hometown. And during your fight with him in the genocide route, Sans makes reference to how he's long since stopped trying to go back somewhere. And similarly to how Sans and Papyrus just moved into Chris's hometown in Deltarune, they aren't actually natives of the underground in Undertale. It's worth pointing out that the only known way to enter the underground is by falling in through Mount Ebba, but they aren't said to enter this way. The bunny girl mentions that they just showed up one day. Since Deltarune came out, there's been a wave of speculation that Sans is originally a Darkner, and it's one I agree with. In Undertale, Sans keeps a picture in his secret lab. Once you talk to the clam girl and learn about Susie, the text on this picture changes to note 3 smiling people, along with the phrase, "Don't forget." All of this adds up to paint a picture where Sans at least became aware of and even close to the heroes of Deltarune, but was then forced to leave their world behind with Papyrus and travel to the world of Undertale. And going there apparently turned out to be a one-way trip. Before we get into how Sans and Papyrus are traveling between universes, let's consider what might happen to push them out of the light world in the first place. I can think of 2 major possibilities. The first has to do with how the world of light is associated with hope. If we can understand the dark world as a dream world, intrinsically linked to the world of the Lightners, then I think it's likely that as the dark world grows more violent, scary, and unstable, the world of the Lightners will also morph similarly, probably affecting the psychology of the Lightners, and what they believe in, their hopes. We might have seen what this looks like already, with the warrior in the hospital, an employee of Icy's Pizza who seems to have grown outright delusional with false beliefs, and violent as a result. The other possibility is that the light world becomes increasingly dangerous because of Chara. And yes, I do think we're dealing with Chara at the end of Chapter 1. The prophecy of the Delta Warrior says that they're going to banish the Angel's heaven, and while the Angel in Undertale could have described Frisk, Asriel, Chara, the player, or all of the above, in Deltarune I think Chara's the most likely figure the term describes. Chara's spirit takes on a life of its own under your guidance in the genocide path of Undertale, and by the end they're describing themselves as a demon, in other words, a fallen angel, and talking about leaving behind the used-up world of Undertale and moving on to the next. It's hard to say right now whether Chris is literally Chara reincarnated in a way, or if they're simply being possessed by Chara much as they're being possessed by the player. But either way, the way Chris acts when they resemble Chara reminds me a lot of portrayals of demonic possession, which shines an interesting light on Tutorial's increased religiousness in Deltarune, and puts an interesting context to the idea that Chris's choices don't matter. Whether their will is being suppressed by the player, Chara, or both, there's still someone around to make their decisions for them a lot of the time. Which might explain why Chris, if indeed there is a real Chris under all the possession, seems so dejected, depressed, and morbid. After all, if you can't choose what to do with your life without your desires being subverted at every turn, can you even be said to exist? We'll come back to the demon Chara and what they might be after to tie this video up, but for now let's get back to Sans. Now, it's no secret that Sans' bedroom has the same kind of fluorescent fire we see under the fast travel doors in the Dark World in Deltarune. And here's where we get into the first Homestuck parallel I'm going to draw, because Homestuck also draws a link between a world of darkness and a world of dreams that I think might help to explain what we're seeing here in Deltarune. So, Homestuck takes place in a realm called Paradox Space, which is basically a multiverse where you can picture every individual universe as a bubble floating around in an endless sea of infinite darkness called the Furthest Ring. Living people can visit the Furthest Ring in their dreams, and it can also be accessed by particular kinds of windows and doorways. Time and space in the Furthest Ring don't entirely make sense, so it's possible to use the Furthest Ring as a sort of shortcut to get to places in the real world more quickly, if you know what you're doing, like Roxy does with the windows of darkness spread around her house. Sans' experience with whatever technology let him travel from Deltarune to Undertale seems to give him similar abilities, letting him move through the world of Undertale in ways that just don't make sense to us, and frequently let him just get out ahead of the player. However, how hard it is to move through the furthest ring seems to correlate to the amount of distance you're trying to cross in the living world, and Sans seems to come up against this barrier too, since it's apparently easy for him to skip a hallway or two, but very difficult if not impossible for him to use the technology he has access to reach the world of Deltarune again. So the Dark World, like the Furthest Ring, is a place of darkness associated with dreams that can also be used to travel through the living world, or to reach other worlds entirely, and which can be accessed by doorways and thresholds. As a result, universes in Paradox Space seem almost completely self-contained, with only very few ways to travel from one to the other, and the same seems to be true in Undertale and Deltarune. Nevertheless, universes can influence and even cause events in each other through different means, and it is possible for beings to inhabit the endless abyss that exists between worlds. Which brings us to Gaster and Chara, the figures that seem to be shaping the background story of Undertale and Deltarune, and the ways they seem to parallel the figures that shape the background story of Homestuck, Calliope and Caliborn. In Homestuck, Caliborn and Calliope are a pair of siblings who gain the power to redefine the multiverse according to a story they grew up with, the story of Homestuck. Early in her own life, Calliope dies, and enters the Furthest Ring as a ghost, making her a skeleton with black eyes in the unknowable abyss between worlds. Which sounds a little bit like Gaster, doesn't it? Also like Gaster, Calliope is the holder of the ultimate secrets behind the lore of the world that Homestuck takes place in. If anyone fully understands the nature of reality in Paradox Space, it's her. Just as Gaster is likely the only person who fully understands what it means for the world to become darker yet darker. But most importantly, once Calliope is in the infinite void of the Furthest Ring, she becomes the primary motivation for her counterpart, Caliborn. Caliborn also dies, in a sense, but is reborn as an omnipotent, unstoppable demon. Like Chara, a fallen angel. And also like Chara, Caliborn never grows up. His form of godhood traps him in an infinite childhood where he can only fulfill his most immature and violent desires. Like Chara, Caliborn is a criticism of the idea of the power gamer, a person who just wants to play a game, who sees the world as a game and its inhabitants as playthings. Like Chara, Caliborn is only really interested in power, both in acquiring more of it and in using it to hurt and dominate whoever he pleases. And most importantly, once Caliborn has achieved absolute power over everything as Lord English, and he's consumed as many worlds as he cares to, the only thing he's really interested in is finding Calliope in the void and killing her. And this is what I really wanted to call attention to, because given all the parallels in this context, I think it's pretty easy to deduce what Chara wants to do exactly. Chara isn't just interested in killing everyone they come across, they're a manifestation of the player's infinite hunger to consume the content of the game. And Gaster represents the final, most inaccessible, most mysterious layer of that content. And the demon has shown itself to be very patient in Undertale, letting the player get through entire routes of even the true pacifist ending before showing its hand. So I suspect Chara's playing the long game and waiting for the events of Deltarune to eventually lead them to the ability to reach Gaster in some way. By the way, I do know that Toby Fox said that the worlds of Deltarune and Undertale are alternate universes, and that many believe this means they aren't connected at all and should be taken as completely separate stories. I agree with this in a way. I expect that Deltarune, like Undertale, is going to have a fully self-contained plot, but there are clear connections between them in the background lore of both games. If you don't want to believe that, then that's cool, but I have a question for you. How do we explain Chris recognizing characters like Alphys, Undyne, and Sans, and talking to them as if they were the same people from Undertale? It seems to me that the only explanation is that either Chara recognizes them, or us, the player, recognize them. And in either scenario, that means that Chris's agency is being influenced by someone with an awareness of how Undertale's story went down. Add to that the fact that Sans seems directly aware of the events of Deltarune, and that Susie is set to apparently cause the events of Undertale, and we're dealing with a complicated web of events lurking in the background where these games seem to directly or indirectly cause each other to come into being. For that reason, I don't really consider Deltarune a sequel or prequel to Undertale. Rather, I view it as a parallel story contained in a separate universe, but the same multiverse, with both worlds bound by some sort of time loop we don't fully understand. That's the only way both stories can be fully coherent. That's the nature of the stories we're dealing with. And that about wraps up our exploration of Deltarune for now. It's possible I'll put out more videos on it if I have any ideas I think are worth exploring, but until then, I hope you enjoyed following along with us. And hey, if you have any particular questions about Deltarune you'd like answered, feel free to leave them in the comments. That's all for now, and until next time, keep rising. Huge thanks go out to my patrons for making this video possible. If you want to help support the channel and come join us at our awesome and growing Discord community, feel free to join us for as little as $1 a month. You can also find me on the r/Hiveswap Reddit and Discord. That's all for now, so thank you again, and as always, keep rising.